Dylan Carter felt the first contraction rip through his body at dawn. He was alone in a small wooden cabin, 20 miles from the nearest medical clinic, with no phone signal and no way to call for help. His truck had broken down 3 days ago. The dirt road was too rough for walking normally, and now he was in labor. But Dylan had no choice. He had to walk. Every step would be agony. But his baby's life depended on reaching that clinic. So Dylan locked the cabin door, grabbed his emergency bag, and started walking into the wilderness. Dylan Carter was 32 years old and had spent the last 4 years teaching at a small elementary school in rural Montana. The school served children from scattered ranches and farms across a massive area. Most of his students traveled an hour or more just to reach the classroom. Dylan lived in a cabin provided by the school district, located 15 miles outside the nearest town of Clearwater. The isolation suited Dylan perfectly. He'd moved to Montana specifically for the solitude, to escape a past that had become too painful to carry. Dylan was transgender and had transitioned 9 years ago. He'd left his hometown in Ohio where everyone knew his history, where people still called him by his old name, where he'd never quite fit. Montana offered anonymity and acceptance through silence. People in rural areas minded their own business. They didn't ask personal questions. They judged you by your work, not your identity. Dylan was a good teacher. His students loved him. Parents respected him. He'd built a quiet, stable life centered around lesson plans, grading papers, and long solitary evenings in his cabin reading books by the fireplace. But that isolation, which had once felt like freedom, had become dangerous in ways Dylan hadn't anticipated. Last November, everything had changed when Dylan met Carson Hayes. Carson was a wildlife biologist who'd come to the area to study elk migration patterns. He'd stopped by the school to give a presentation about local wildlife to Dylan's class. The connection between them had been immediate and unexpected. Carson was intelligent, kind, and comfortable with long silences, the kind of person who understood the value of solitude. After the presentation, Carson had asked Dylan to dinner. One dinner had turned into weekend hikes. Weekend hikes had turned into Carson staying overnight at Dylan's cabin. For 3 months, Dylan had been happier than he'd been in years. Carson knew Dylan was transgender and didn't care. They'd talked about everything: childhoods, dreams, fears. Carson had even mentioned wanting to settle down someday, maybe have kids. Then February had come, and Carson's research project had ended. He'd gotten an offer for another study in Alaska. He'd asked Dylan to come with him, to leave Montana and start a new adventure together. Dylan had wanted to say yes, but he'd also been scared. Moving to Alaska meant leaving the life he'd carefully built, the security of his teaching job, the safety of his isolated cabin. It meant committing to Carson fully, trusting that the relationship was real and lasting. Dylan had asked for time to think about it. Carson had said he'd wait, but the research team was leaving in 2 weeks. He needed an answer. Before Dylan could decide, before he could process what he wanted, Carson had gotten the news. His mother in Colorado had suffered a stroke. Carson had to leave immediately. He'd promised to call, to stay in touch, to come back when his mother was stable. But weeks passed with minimal contact. Carson's texts became shorter, less frequent. The phone call stopped. By March, it was clear. Carson had moved on with his life, and Dylan wasn't part of it. Dylan had been heartbroken, but not entirely surprised. His past had taught him that relationships were temporary, that people left, that counting on someone else was dangerous. What Dylan hadn't expected was discovering, 6 weeks after Carson left, that he was pregnant. The pregnancy had been a complete shock. Dylan had been on testosterone for 9 years. He hadn't had a period in 8 years. Every medical professional he'd consulted had said pregnancy, while on testosterone, was extremely unlikely. But extremely unlikely wasn't impossible. Dylan's body had experienced breakthrough ovulation during those 3 months with Carson. They'd been intimate regularly, never using protection because Dylan had genuinely believed he couldn't conceive. When Dylan had finally taken a pregnancy test in late March, after weeks of unexplained nausea and exhaustion, the positive result had devastated him. He'd driven 3 hours to a clinic in Billings for confirmation, too paranoid to see a local doctor who might spread gossip. The clinic doctor had confirmed it. Dylan was 12 weeks pregnant. The doctor had explained about breakthrough ovulation, about how testosterone suppressed but didn't eliminate reproductive function, about how rare but possible pregnancy was in his situation. Dylan had sat in the clinic parking lot for 2 hours, staring at the ultrasound image, trying to process what was happening. He was pregnant with Carson's baby, and Carson was gone, living his life in Colorado and Alaska, completely unaware. Dylan had tried calling Carson once to tell him about the pregnancy. The call had gone to voicemail. Dylan had left a vague message asking Carson to call back. Carson never did. Dylan had tried one more time 2 weeks later. Same result. After that, Dylan had stopped trying. If Carson didn't want to be in Dylan's life, Dylan wouldn't force the issue. He would handle the pregnancy alone. Dylan had decided to continue the pregnancy. The decision hadn't been easy or clear-cut. But despite everything, the fear, the loneliness, the logistical nightmare of being pregnant in rural Montana, Dylan had wanted this baby. He'd always imagined having children someday. He'd become a teacher because he loved kids, loved watching them learn and grow. This pregnancy wasn't planned, wasn't happening under ideal circumstances, but it was real, and Dylan would make it work. The pregnancy had progressed through spring and into summer. Dylan had finished the school year, telling colleagues and parents that he was taking a sabbatical for the next academic year for personal reasons. Most people didn't pry. By 20 weeks, Dylan's belly was undeniably prominent. He'd stopped going into town except for essential supplies. He'd arranged for groceries to be delivered to a pickup point 10 miles away. He'd become even more isolated than before, essentially disappearing from public view. Dylan had found a small medical clinic in Clearwater, about 20 miles from his cabin, that provided prenatal care. The drive took 45 minutes on the dirt roads. Dylan went for monthly checkups, keeping the appointments brief and professional. The doctor, an older woman named Dr. Patricia Reynolds, had been concerned about Dylan's isolation. She'd asked multiple times if Dylan had support, if someone could stay with him as the due date approached. Dylan had assured her he'd be fine, that he had friends nearby who could help. This was a lie. Dylan had no close friends in the area. He was planning to handle labor and delivery completely alone, except for the clinic staff. Dr. Reynolds had given Dylan clear instructions. When labor started, Dylan needed to get to the clinic immediately. Rural births could be unpredictable. If complications arose, the clinic could call for a helicopter to the hospital in Billings. But Dylan needed to be at the clinic when labor began. Dylan had agreed. His plan was simple. When contractions started, he'd drive himself to the clinic. The 45-minute drive would be uncomfortable but manageable. What Dylan hadn't planned for was his truck breaking down. At 37 weeks pregnant, 3 weeks before his due date, Dylan's truck had stopped working. He'd been driving back from the grocery pickup point when the engine had started making terrible, grinding noises. Dylan had barely made it back to his cabin before the truck died completely. Dylan had tried to fix it himself. He'd learned basic mechanics from necessity, but the problem was beyond his skill. The truck needed a professional mechanic, and the nearest one was in Clearwater. Dylan had tried calling for a tow truck, but his cabin had no cell reception. He'd have to drive to Clearwater to arrange repairs. But he couldn't drive to Clearwater because his truck was broken. The circular problem felt impossible. Dylan had considered walking the 10 miles to the grocery pickup point where he could use the phone. But 10 miles pregnant felt dangerous and exhausting. He decided to wait. His due date wasn't for 3 weeks. Surely he could wait a few days until he figured out a solution. But babies don't follow schedules. Then pain hit. Sharp, intense, unmistakable. A real contraction. Dylan sat up in bed, breathing through the pain, trying to stay calm. This couldn't be labor. He was still 3 weeks early. But the contraction passed, and 5 minutes later, another one came. Then another. Dylan was in labor. And he was alone in a cabin, 20 miles from the clinic, with no truck and no way to call for help. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. But Dylan forced himself to think logically. He had options. He could wait and hope someone drove by, though the road to his cabin saw maybe 1 car a week. He could try to flag down a passing vehicle. Or he could walk 20 miles, on foot, in labor, across rough terrain and dirt roads. It seemed impossible. But Dylan looked at his emergency bag, packed and ready by the door. He thought about his baby, about the complications that could arise without medical care. He thought about Dr. Reynolds' words, "Get to the clinic when labor starts." Dylan made his decision. He would walk. Every step would be torture, but he had no other choice. Dylan locked his cabin door and started walking at 6 a.m. The contractions were still 5 minutes apart, manageable if he walked between them, stopped, and breathed through each one. The first mile was bearable. The dirt road was rough but familiar. Dylan had walked parts of it before for exercise. He focused on breathing, on putting one foot in front of the other. The second mile was harder. Contractions were getting stronger, closer together. Dylan had to stop every few minutes, gripping trees or fence posts, breathing through waves of pain. By the third mile, Dylan was sweating despite the cool morning air. His back ached. His feet hurt. But he kept walking. Mile 4 brought Dylan to the main road. Still dirt, but wider, more maintained. The walking was easier physically but harder emotionally. This road saw occasional traffic, and Dylan kept hoping a car would appear. None did. Mile 5, mile 6. Contractions were 3 minutes apart now. Dylan could barely walk 20 feet before another one hit. He'd stop, brace himself against whatever was nearby, breathe through the pain, then force himself to keep moving. By mile 7, Dylan was crying. Not from despair, but from pure physical exhaustion and pain. His water broke, soaking his pants, making each step uncomfortable and cold. But he kept walking. Mile 8, mile 9. Dylan lost track of time. The sun climbed higher. He was sweating and shivering simultaneously. His legs shook with every step. But the clinic was getting closer. 10 miles left. 9 miles. 8. At mile 12, Dylan saw a truck approaching from behind. He turned, waving desperately. The truck slowed. An elderly rancher Dylan recognized from the grocery pickup point. The rancher rolled down his window, looking shocked at the sight of Dylan. Without asking questions, he helped Dylan into the truck. 20 minutes later, they pulled up to the clinic in Clearwater. Dr. Reynolds was waiting. The rancher had radioed ahead. She helped Dylan inside, checked him quickly. He was at 9 centimeters, fully effaced, ready to deliver. 2 hours later, Dylan gave birth to a healthy baby boy. 6 pounds, 4 ounces. Perfect and crying loudly. Dr. Reynolds placed the baby on Dylan's chest. Dylan held his son and sobbed. From relief, exhaustion, overwhelming love, and the realization that he'd actually done it. He'd walked 12 miles in labor to save his baby's life. The story of Dylan's walk spread through the community. The rancher told his wife, who told the grocery store owner, who told everyone who came through. Within days, the entire region knew about the teacher who'd walked miles in labor. People showed up at the clinic with food, baby supplies, offers of help. The school board arranged for Dylan's truck to be repaired and delivered to the clinic. Parents of Dylan's students organized a meal train for when Dylan returned home. The isolation Dylan had built so carefully crumbled. But instead of feeling exposed, Dylan felt supported. The community that had given him anonymous acceptance now gave him active care. 3 weeks after the birth, Dylan got a call from an unknown number. Carson's voice came through, shaky and emotional. He'd heard about what happened through mutual friends. He was coming to Montana. He wanted to meet his son. He wanted to explain why he'd disappeared. Dylan agreed to meet him. But this time, Dylan wasn't alone and desperate. He had a community, a son, and the knowledge that he'd walked through fire and survived. Today, Dylan's son is 3 months old, named River, after the landscape that nearly defeated Dylan but ultimately showed his strength. Carson is part of River's life now, co-parenting, rebuilding trust slowly. They're not together romantically, but they're figuring out how to be family. Dylan returned to teaching this fall. His students welcomed him back with homemade cards and excitement. The community still talks about the teacher who walked miles in labor, the story becoming local legend. Sometimes survival requires doing the impossible. Strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about walking forward even when every step hurts. So, here's my question. Would you have walked 20 miles in labor? How far would you go to protect someone you love? Drop your thoughts below. If this story taught you about willpower and the strength we find when we have no other choice, share it. Because Dylan proved that mothers and fathers will walk through fire for their children. Sometimes literally.